Hello and welcome to another episode of Simply Latin. Today we shall take a look at the pronominal adjectives. Now you may wonder, what are the pronominal adjectives? Well, we see that in Latin there is a certain subset of adjectives in the first and second declension that don't quite follow the standard rules of declension in the singular, and these are called as the pronominal adjectives. Now, having known the definition, you may wonder, how many of these adjectives are there? Well, there are a total of 9 of them. Which are they? Let's take a look. First, we have alius, then unus, alter, neuter, nullus, ullus, uter, totus, and solus. Now, when you look at the pronominal adjectives, we see that first and foremost, they don't just like following the rules. And therefore, you may ask, are there different rules for these adjectives? Or could it be that they follow different rules by themselves? Well, we will see that in the singular, the rule is slightly different, but then it is quite similar to something that we have already done before. Let's take a look at that a bit later. But how do we remember these 9 pronominal adjectives? Well, we see that there is an anagram to remember these pronominal adjectives, and that is UNUS NAUTA, which means one sailor. Now, you could remember these pronominal adjectives in this specific order because we see that when we arrange them in this order, it tends to group related words together. So let's take a look at what are the adjectives in unus. So we have you, where you have unus, una, unum, then nullus, nulla, nullum, ullus, ulla, ullum, and solus, sola, solum. Then you have neuter, neutra, neutrum, alter, altra, altrum, uter, utra, utrum, totus, tota, totum, and alius, alia, aliud. So these are the 9 pronominal adjectives grouped together in the anagram UNUS NAUTA. And if you follow this, you'll be able to remember these 9 without much difficulty. Now, let us take a look at what these mean. Unus una unum basically refers to one, alone, single. Nullus nulla nullum refers to no or none. Ullus ulla ullum refers to any one, whereas solus sola solum basically means alone. And here we see that unus and ullus come from the same root word. Unus means one, while ullus means anyone, but usually in a negative context. On the other hand, we see nullus is the opposite of ullus. Now let us take a look at nauta. So you have neuter, neutra, neutrum, which means neither, alter, altra, altrum, which refers to the other. And here, when we speak of the other or another, it basically refers to situations where you have 2 options. So when you have 2 options, you will use alter, altra, altrum. If there are more than two, you will have another word for it, which we will take a look shortly. Next, you have uter, utra, utrum, which means which of the two or either. Then you have totus, tota, totum, which means whole, entire, or all. And then you have alius, alia, aliud, which refers to other, another. And here we see that we will use alius when there are three or more options. So as we said earlier, alter, altra, altrum is used when you have two options, whereas alius, alia, aliud is used when you have more than two options. Now, neuter is the opposite of uter, and we also see that alter and alius are also related too. Now, alter means another of two options, whereas alius will refer to another where there are three or more options. Now, let us take a look at some of the examples of the pronominal adjectives. In fact, these definitions for these illustrate that they are completely a different class of adjectives. Now, pronominal adjectives will resemble a pronoun by identifying or specifying rather than simply describing something which we will see later. So let's take a look at some of the examples. I see no house. And in Latin, this basically would mean nullum villam video. Now, when we look at descriptive adjectives, we see I see a pretty house, and in Latin, pulchram villam video. And here we see that pronominal adjectives will resemble a pronoun by identifying or specifying rather than describing, like the word pretty in this example, which just describes. And therefore, we see that this class of adjectives gets a slightly different declension, but only in the singular. And so let's take a look at unus una unum, which means one alone in the singular. So let us illustrate unus una unum. You have the cases masculine, feminine, neuter. So let's take a look at unus first in the masculine. So in the nominative, you will have unus, genitive, unius, dative, uni, accusative, unum, and uno in the ablative. With regards to the feminine, you'll have una in the nominative case, unius in the genitive, uni in the dative, unam in the accusative, and una in the ablative. And with regards to the neuter, you'll have unum in the nominative, unius in the genitive, uni in the dative, unum in the accusative, and uno in the ablative. And if you take a look at this chart, you will see that the nominative is standard. But you'll see there are some similarities between some cases in the three genders. We see that in the genitive, all the endings are in eus. In masculine, feminine, and neuter, the ending and the word itself is unius. Whereas in the dative, we see that it ends in e for all genders. Now, we see that unus una unum is also similar to ille, illa, illiud. And here we see that we can contrast these with demonstratives like ille, illa, illud. And here we see that the pattern will look quite similar. So in the nominative, you have unus una unum, whereas in the demonstratives, we have ille illa illum. Now, we also see that in the genitive, it ends with ius, whereas in the demonstrative, also you have the ending same ius. Similarly, in the dative, the endings, as we said, were all in I, and here also we have the same endings. Now, even with regards to the accusative case, we see that the endings are similar. And therefore, this is one of the way in which we can actually remember these pronominal adjectives in the singular. When we come to the plural, you will see that it is still more familiar. So, with this clear, we can now move on to the next part of it. Now, let's take a look at another example of totus, tota, totum, which refers to whole, entire, or all. So in the masculine, you have totus, totius, toti, totum, and toto. In the feminine, you have tota in the nominative, totius in the genitive, toti in the dative, totam in the accusative, and tota in the ablative. Whereas in the neuter, you have totum in the nominative, totius in the genitive, toti in the dative, totum in the accusative, and toto in the ablative. Now we see that demonstratives are words that point out and specify rather than describing, and these we see are sometimes also used as pronouns. Now let's take another example. Ille villam videt, which means that guy sees the house. And here we see that, like ille as itself, it could also be that guy or he. Similarly, we see another example. Unus villam videt, one guy sees the house. So here we see that unus shares its declension with these demonstratives because their functions is also similar. Now let's take a look at the plural. Now the plural declension for these is regular and it will follow the first and second declension rules. Let's take a look at totus, tota, totum in the plural. So in the masculine, you will have toti in the nominative, totorum in the genitive, totis in the dative, totos in the accusative, and totis in the ablative. Whereas in the feminine, you will have tote in the nominative, totarum in the genitive, totis in the dative, totas in the accusative, and totis in the ablative. Whereas in the neuter, you will have tota in the nominative, totorum in the genitive, totis in the dative, tota in the accusative, and totis in the ablative. Now you can just see how these follow the rules of the first and second declension. For example, when you take a look at tote, it follows the same as rose, rosarum, roses, rosas, roses. And when it comes to the neuter, it follows the same as templum, as you have templa, templorum, templis, templa, templis. And in this way, we see that Remembering it in the plural is very simple, as you are already familiar with the first and second declension rules. Now, although the plural for unus is rare, and you have more than one of the word one, we see that unus can also have the meanings of same or only, and so this works in the plural as well. Now, it also happens in situations where a poetic plural is used for singular, or like other words like castra, they are plural but with a singular meaning. Now, let's illustrate this with an example. So, we have a sentence in una castra, which basically means into one camp. So here you see that even though castra is plural, but it has a singular meaning. And this is what we basically refer to as the poetic plural. Now, when you look at castra, it is basically neuter, accusative case, and in the plural. Likewise, there is this phrase, uni et alteri, which means the ones and the others, or it can also mean one group and the other. Now let us take a look at certain examples. Do donum tibi soli, which means I am giving this gift to you alone. And here we see that soli is dative, singular, agreeing with tibi. And therefore, as you may be already familiar by now, that when it refers to two terms used relatively together, the case and the number should match. Now, let's take a look at some rules along with some examples. So we see that when we use alius and alter together, they can be used correlatively when in adjacent clauses, meaning the one or some and then the others. Let's make it clear with an example. Alius hodie venit, alius cras veniet. The one comes today, the other tomorrow. And here you see that alius is used correlatively to mean one and the other in the same sentence. Another example, alteri regem vident, alteri reginam vident. Some see the king, others see the queen. And here you see that how alius and alter have been used correlatively in the same sentence, having in one some and the other the others. Now, when two forms of alius occur within the same clause, each may be translated giving a correlative meaning. That is, each may be translated twice. Let's have a look at this. Alius aliud fecerat, which means the one had done one thing, the other had done another thing. To put it in simple words, we can say one had done one thing. Similar, another sentence. Ali ab alio inventi sunt. Some were found by one man, others by another man. To put it in other words, we can say some were found by another. Now, all these examples will become much clearer when we take a look at the examples and the exercises that we have later on. Now, just in all cases, we also have certain exceptions here for the pronominal adjectives as well. So, we see that in poetry, the genitive ius becomes ius. So the long I or e in the genitive singular ending gets shortened to fit into the meter of the verse. Next, we see that the genitive sometimes shortens to is. And here, one of the example that we can have is UNUS NAUTA, which means of one measure. Now, there are also scores of examples of writers forgetting entirely about this pronominal declension in providing words with the standard first and second declension, genitive and dative endings. So sometimes these rules can be put aside and you may have the standard first and declension, genitive and dative endings as well. So these are the pronominal adjectives. The adjectives aren't quite descriptive words, they are pronominal, and the declension in the genitive and dative singular reflects that they are slightly different. And here we need to keep in mind these two cases. And if we are familiar with these two cases, then it will make our life a lot easier. So let us take a look at some examples and let us translate these sentences or these phrases into English. So first we have utrum librorum legis. So let us try to find the meaning of each word and then translate the sentence. Utrum comes from the root word uter. Now it can be either masculine or neuter. The case is accusative and it is singular, which means either or which of the two. Librorum comes from the root liber libri, masculine, second declension, and in the genitive case. And since it is plural, it means books. Legis comes from legere. It is second person indicative future and in the singular, which therefore means to read. So, from these meanings, we can say either of the books will you read, or to put it in a much better way, which of these two books will you read? Which of the two books will you read? Let's take a look at another sentence. This may be quite long, but let's have a look at it. Totus mundus laudavit unam feminam reginam pulchram nobilimque. Totus comes from the root totus, masculine, nominative case, singular, which means whole. Similarly, mundus comes from the root mundus mundi, masculine, second declension, nominative singular, which means world. Laudavit comes from the root laudare, is third person singular, indicative perfect, which means to praise. Unam comes from the root unus, feminine, singular, and in the accusative case, which means one. Feminine comes from femina, feminae, first declension, feminine, and accusative case in the singular, which means woman. Reginam comes from the root regina, reginae, first declension feminine, accusative singular case, which means queen. Pulchram comes from the root pulcher, second declension feminine, accusative case singular, which means beautiful. And nobilinque comes from the root nobilis, feminine, accusative case singular for noble. And que, as we all know, is used as and. Now from these, let us try to frame a sentence. Whole world praise one single woman, queen, beautiful and noble. To put it in a much better way, We can say the whole world praised a single woman, a beautiful and noble queen. The next sentence, amicus meum ullum verbum pro rege negaverat ibi stetit et tacuit. Amicus comes from the root amicus amici, male, second declension, nominative case, singular, which means friend. Meus comes from the root meus, masculine, nominative, singular, which means my. Ullum comes from ullum, ulla ullum, masculine, nominative, or it can also be neuter, nominative or acquisitive, singular, which means any. Verbum comes from verbum verbi, and here we see that it is the second declension, neuter, nominative case, or it can be acquisitive, singular, which means word. Pro is a preposition which means for, in favor of, before, in place of. Rege comes from the root rex regis, masculine, third declension, ablative case in the singular, which means in or on king. Negaverat comes from the root negare, third person singular, indicative pluperfect, which means had denied. Eb is an adverb, which means there or then. Stetit comes from sistere, which is a third person singular, indicative perfect, which means stood or caused. Et is a conjunction which refers to and or also, whereas taquit comes from tacere, which is a third person singular, indicative perfect, which means was silent. So from finding all these meanings, the sentence roughly would look like this. Friend my, any, word before, in place of, in on king, had denied, there stood, caused, and also was silent. And thus, by clearing out and trying to see what makes sense, we end up with this sentence. My friend had denied any word before or in front of the king. There he stood and was silent. So, therefore, as you can see, after finding out the different meanings, you can then see which one suits exactly and which one sounds better, and accordingly you can translate and make your sentence in English. Now let's take a look at the last two exercises. Altera castra a sola homine edificata sunt. Altera comes from the root alter, feminine, nominative ablative case in the singular, which means the other. Castra comes from castra, castrorum, neuter, plural, nominative accusative case, which means military camp. A is a preposition which means from, out of, by, or since. Solo comes from the root solus, masculine, ablative case, plural, which means alone. Homine comes from the root homo hominis, masculine, third declension, ablative case in the singular, which means human or man. Adificata comes from edificare, nominative ablative case in the singular, in the participle perfect passive, which means to build. Sunt comes from the root esse, indicative present, third person plural, which means to be. And then by putting these together, we see the other military camp by alone man was built. Thus, by clearing up certain things, we can translate this as the other military camp was built by a man alone. Or you can say another military camp was built by a single man. Both the translations are correct. And finally, we have ali servi alius dominus vident. So ali comes from alius, which is the dative singular, which means another. Servi comes from the root servus servi, masculine, second declension, nominative plural or genitive singular, which means slave. Alius comes from alius, which is plural accusative case in the masculine, which means another. Dominus comes from the root dominus domini, masculine, second declension, accusative case plural, which means master. And vident comes from the root videre, third person plural, indicative present, which mean to see. And thus, we can translate the sentence by putting these words together roughly as another slaves, another masters they see. Thus, we can say some slaves see some masters, other slaves see other masters. So we see that this is it for the pronominal adjectives. Let us meet next time for another interesting class in Latin. Till then, take care.